Hello, and welcome to The Smiling Human, where collectively we evolve through inquiry. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Smiling Human podcast. Today, I'm speaking with Leah Fink. Leah is dedicated to advancing mental health in the workplace. With a rich background in addictions and mental health, her expertise is in discerning the difference between the social elements that foster healthy environments versus toxic ones. Her goal is to reshape the narrative surrounding mental health, seeing it not only as an individual issue, but something truly shaped by our environment. This goal prompted her to establish All Thrive, where she could bring these insights to the workplace and help others in recognizing the profound impact that they have on the mental health of employees. Through her work, she transforms leadership and culture to foster an environment where both the company and its employees flourish. We cover topics from power dynamics to the unique challenges faced by women in today's working environments. I hope you enjoy. Well, Leah, thank you so much for being here. I'm excited to engage in another meaningful conversation together.
I'm so excited as well, and thanks for having me.
Of course. So I'll ask you the same question I ask everybody at the head of the show. What's the last thing that made you smile?
Well, right now I have a cat sitting on my feet, and our cats like to do this. They like the warmth and the fuzziness, and it's really lovely to have cuddly cats.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, pets bring so much joy into our life. That's great. So
Yeah.
our listeners would have heard a little bit about you from the intro. For myself and for them, I'm curious to extend this question. How is it that you came to be in this line of work that you currently find yourself in?
Yeah, I think probably like everyone else, it's been a very full journey, lots of different places, and I think there's two pieces that impacted me the most, and one was when I was a teenager, getting to start doing self-development courses, which I absolutely loved. I thought there was huge power in them, and how sometimes it can just take that outside perspective or that experience to shift your viewpoint of yourself and the world and how you relate to other people. So I knew from when I was about 16 that I wanted to do something in that realm, which of course there's no set path to. And the way that I got through to that path, or found my way, was actually through social work and working in addictions and mental health for a number of years in a wilderness-based program, which just combined a lot of my different passions and gave me, I'm so grateful to it because it gave me such a profound view and understanding of people in a way I don't think I would have gotten from a lot of the other avenues.
Brilliant. So this aspect of self-development and the external perspective is a really big one. I know that through the previous conversations I've been having, a lot of at least one of the common threads that has arisen is this common cultural narrative. And it's not just a single narrative, but it's a narrative. There's multiple ones that we pick up as we're going. And so maybe just to paint a larger picture, and we can weave this into social work and how it is that we can bring the core essence of meaning, which is the theme for this season, into this. When you say that this outside perspective offers you a change in perspective, a change in view of self, where is it that you were and where is it that you shifted to through this period of time?
I think when I talk about the original one, it's honestly maybe too far back to realize it. I think as I'm older and I've done a lot more of this reflection and sought out other ways to learn and grow, the reflection I always go into it with, or the idea I go into it with, is I think it's very hard for people to change with only their own perspective. There has to be some sort of spark from outside. So whether that's a book you read, whether it's a course you do, whether it's someone gives you some feedback, there's something that inspires me. And so if I think of maybe some of my more recent inspirations, I would say would be a little bit more in a spiritual realm. I'm looking a lot more at mindset. As a business owner, there's so much mindset, so much unconscious stuff that comes up in terms of how you see yourself and your business. And so for me, that's probably a lot of the recent ones have been around, well, what am I really putting out there? And then how does that affect what I'm getting back?
Right. It reminds me of a quote, I believe that's attributed to Albert Einstein, that says, we cannot solve a problem that was created. We cannot solve a problem with the same level of consciousness that was present to create it. Something like this, paraphrasing. And so, when I also heard you say earlier that you gained a greater understanding having started engaging in social work in these wilderness programs, and this piece around the difficulty of changing one's own mind without additional or external perspectives. And so, as it relates to social work, and particularly, I'm curious about the work that you're doing as it relates to women in the workplace and this cultural narrative that has been slowly unraveling about what it is women ought to be doing or could be doing, or all of these different sort of questions and perspectives. How much of those narratives do you personally find in the work that you're doing? That is to say, these more limited perspectives. Is this something you encounter often in the social work that you're doing?
That's a really good question with a lot of different directions. I'll say to tie them together, maybe something I observe, because it is a big piece of the work I do now with companies, is understanding power. And power just being like a very neutral thing that's like the influence that we have over ourselves and the world around us. And when we talk about obviously something like a workplace where there's leadership, supervisors, managers, CEOs, you can see those power dynamics a little easier. And you really have to be aware of how they're impacting relationship. And what I often reflect on in my own experience as a woman is there are also dynamics that exist in our society, the statuses that we have assigned to certain groups of people. And so in my work, I think there's both an acknowledgement, because when I look at my own journey and some other journeys, and this is where the mindset piece might come in, being conscious of how me being a woman might have impacted that compared to if I'd been taking this journey as a man. I've definitely met more male consultants in general in the business world than female consultants. And when we look at this piece of power and influence, acknowledging that it is a factor, but it doesn't have to be a limiting one. But we do have to embrace it differently, knowing that if you look at history, if you look at the way our society still interacts, my voice is heard differently. And so, really being able to embrace that feminine side, that feminine power or feminine influence, while still acknowledging that this dynamic exists, has been a really big part of my work. And it's a huge part too when I interact with leaders. And I do know that generally a bit more of my work has been with female leaders because I think they resonate with some of the things I talk about, which is acknowledging that that created a different journey for women. And they've had experiences that maybe weren't always beneficial with those power dynamics that helps them empathize then with their employees a little bit easier. And not to say that men can't do this. I work a lot with men that have also taken this journey, but they're taking it from a different place.
I would love to hear more, if you would speak on it, Leah, about some of those interactions or qualities of the journey that have been common amongst women that might be distinct or different when it comes to these power dynamics and this corporate journey. Can you speak a little bit more to that?
Yeah. So if I can go big picture for a moment, because
Of
I
course.
like to geek out about this stuff. This is our very first conversation.
Yeah.
A lot of my view of power and the way that I help facilitate understanding of power comes from the right use of power, which created by Dr. Cedar Barstow. It's an amazing modality. You can find the book. You can look them up online. It's a fantastic way of looking at it. And some of the things we also explore, for example, is like the biological pieces of how our body reacts to power. And one of the experiences that happens is even when people are told to think about being in a position of power, they operate from their prefrontal cortex. Without going into brain science, it's like high level thinking, you're nice and calm and rational. And when you have less power in a situation, even if you're told to just think about a role with less power, and they did this with these status powers as well as actual roles and positions, you actually operate more from your amygdala, which is that emotional center of your brain. So you get your fight, flight, freeze type reactions, and it becomes this little bit of fear and vulnerability that happens. So, taking that big picture context, when I talk about leaders and especially female leaders in the workplace, acknowledging that at the same time that you might be a leader, first of all, you might actually be experiencing some of this dynamic with a male subordinate, someone that you're trying to support. So how does that interaction happen? And like, how does that impact how you're then going to lead them? And then even more as well, if you're, let's say, a leader or a woman in the workplace in a room with a lot of male voices, there's this slight bit of different experience that you're going to have this kind of vulnerability. And also, there's been a lot of studies done on how female voices are perceived, how, if there's women in the room and there's as many women as men, there's estimated to be more women and that they talk more. Even when they actually break down the science, that's not the case. So we're really looking at not that we have to, just give women. I've heard this a lot, right? We're just trying to give women positions, and it feels this tokenism. And I think there's a real sense potentially for some people of loss in the shifts that are happening. But we really do have to acknowledge some of these systems that our whole society and world are based on that are still alive, and they do still impact us. And it's not just about taking one action, but actually looking at those systems and exploring them in order to be able to move them to something more of what you actually intentionally want.
Absolutely. I think what you're speaking to is quite powerful because sometimes, at least in my experience, when we're speaking about systems, we're talking on these big picture aspects and it can become a little bit nebulous. But you've done a really great job, I think, in laying out the fact that these differences are not only culturally instantiated or they're not only mentally instantiated, that we do. And I think this is neither positive nor negative, but have a biological predisposition to interpret the feminine, the female, different than the masculine and the male. And so being able to recognize that that is innate inside of our bodies and that that will necessarily create a potential distortion in how we're interpreting people in their roles and how that's going to affect the balance of power within relationships is a really key piece. I think that's quite powerful. One thing I wanted to add here, and I think there's great pieces that we can open up into, is that in some of our previous conversations, which our listeners unfortunately don't have the luxury of having attended, you mentioned to me that when people are placed in roles of power, or perhaps it was only if they imagine themselves, I can't remember exactly, but that they noticed and were able to measure lower activity of mirror neurons in the brain. And for those who are not familiar, mirror neurons are a very interesting cell in the body that are responsible for mimicry. And it's one of the pieces that plays into our sense of empathy or our capacity to empathize. And so with lower mirror neuron activation, one of the elements that would contribute to empathy is actually diminished, particularly that we would be behaving in the same way that other people are behaving. So I just wanted to add that in.
Can I
Yeah,
expand on that for a moment? Because I think
please.
it's just for clarity too, specifying that that is not just that when you're given a leadership position, but this is specifically for people who have been in positions of power for a long time. And so when we look at some of the people, some of our leaders in the world, if we look at maybe some people who are very wealthy and have been in leadership positions in their organization for a long time, we see this disconnect happening. And so we see that, first of all, they're getting less feedback, right? The higher up you get, the less constructive feedback you get. And there's also less of an awareness of power the more we have of it. And then this, I think, is what contributes to this piece of missing mirror neurons, or starting to lose that connection with them. And yeah, the idea that someone smiles and you smile back, that's the very basics of mirror neurons. And when I was mentioning earlier about how sometimes women might feel more of a sense of connection with that work, you use those mirror neurons and you activate them more, and you activate more of a working to support someone else when you have less power because you're in this vulnerable state. You'll usually try to do what this other person is saying, right? It's like listening to your boss. It's easier. You're probably rewarded more when you do what your boss says. And so when you're in those positions, you often feel that sense a bit more, and you're more empathetic to it. And so I think it is actually quite hard. And this isn't to make excuses and not to say it's impossible, but sometimes, especially for male leaders who have been in those roles for a long time, they haven't gotten as much feedback to literally reactivate some of those systems and say, well, do I recognize what it's like for my employees and their experience? And how much can I care about that? And how much am I willing to shift my preferences or my way of thinking to start exploring those pieces? It's a lot of work as a leader, and it can be actually quite challenging and going against a lot of patterns that your brain has naturally built over a long time.
And it might actually be temperamentally unnatural for some. And I think this ties into the biological differences, at least on average, between men and women when we look at the big five traits as an example. And so what you're speaking to, this capacity and willingness to empathize in conjunction with a sensitivity to that, the threat of, if I don't listen, maybe it's going to be, something bad's going to happen, and I could be rewarded if I do the right thing. Those two pieces would be attributed to trait compassion and trait neuroticism, respectively. And people sometimes get a little uppity about the word neuroticism. It just means sensitivity to negative emotions. And on average, women tend to be higher in compassion, which is a trait that is directly associated with an investment and care for other people's emotional experience. What is it like to be them, and how can we make that a positive experience? And neuroticism, being a sensitivity to negative emotion, is a higher threat detection. And so you can imagine that in a scenario where a woman might find herself, and correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm missing the mark on this one, find herself in a power differential under a male subordinate who's been in that position for a long time, there's more impetus from her to care about what his experience is than he has for her, just as an average on the temperamental space. And so when we take that in conjunction with a power differential, I can only imagine that honestly, what arises for me is an emotional experience. There's a great sense of helplessness or powerlessness or being sort of trapped and almost having my puppet strings pulled, like a loss of agency in this sense, not only because of the power dynamic, but also because of the differential and temperament. How does that land for you?
Yeah. I first think it's interesting because often when I start talking about power with groups, one of the first questions is what comes up when you think about power? And so, interestingly, right, a lot of people go a very similar direction to you of, oh yeah, puppet strings or manipulation or control, or they could say like, yeah, responsibility and care, and those different experiences all influence not only your emotional experience, which is I think a huge piece, but also then how you are going to go forward as a leader, how you're going to step forward in the world. And I see right now, I think we're kind of in a swing position of there is more awareness of some of these things happening. We see a lot of abuses and misuses of power in the world, that a lot of people are trying to go more on this compassionate side and sometimes even trying to get rid of their power in a not healthy way, because you can't fully get rid of it, right? They're trying to like disown that piece of themselves and say, no, I'm an equal, I'm a servant leader, I'm not really the boss. So I just wanted to mention that dynamic because I do think it's an interesting one, just of how you are using your power, and whether that's a leader, whether that's as a white person, whether that's as a male, whether as whatever roles you're taking on and whatever statuses you have, recognizing that you're doing that from your experience. And that might be a helpful thing and it might not be a helpful thing. And I think when you start talking about like adding temperament and adding all these layers, it starts to become, there's so many ways that we can look at this. And to me, when we're talking about all of these different layers, it can become more about, or it helps to become more about individual relationships. Because what happens is, of course, there's, for example, a female boss, male subordinate, there's a power dynamic in that she has a role that has more influence and power. He has a status that has more influence and power. So those are interacting. And if we start making rules of like, oh, well, the woman's got a compassionate temperament, and so she's going to do this because it's the male, and he's going to do this because it starts getting complicated. Whereas when we start looking at individual relationships and how responsive we can be in the moment, we could recognize, okay, well, so this dynamic exists between just the two of us. What ways as a leader in her role, maybe could I interact that really support this person at work? And how can I be responsive to their needs in the workplace? And that's if she's being like the best, most ethical, awesome, responsive leader ever possible for her. And then in the same time, he might be looking at these dynamics in the workplace and thinking like, well, what can I do, knowing my voice as a male is a little bit different in this situation? And that's him taking kind of that ethical responsibility for his power and influence in that situation. So I think in worry of going too big with all the different dynamics that can play, and it becomes more about how we can respond to each relationship and each situation instead of sometimes overgeneralizing to me a little bit in, well, a woman this way, a man's this way, and how do we make them work together?
Absolutely. I think the role of generalization in scenarios like this is such that it can help us identify potential influences rather than generate
Yeah.
rules of action. And so if I put myself in that position, I know myself to be slightly less agreeable and more assertive in my communication temperamentally. And so when I find myself in situations where there might be a power differential, if I'm facilitating or something like this, I know that going in, and I check that going in because I understand that internal awareness and that proclivity that's not just sort of male associated, although it is, but it's personally associated. I can come across very blunt and to the point. And if I'm working in a space where people are tapping into their emotional experience, it doesn't always produce the most beautiful results. So I think what I would encourage the listeners to do is that in reflecting on what Lee and I are speaking about here, think about how you are. Do you find yourself more inclined to the compassionate, or do you find yourself more inclined to the assertive? Are you quite industrious? Do you go after whatever you want regardless of how it impacts other people, or maybe with less regard? Or do you find yourself maybe more preoccupied with how your actions are going to impact others? All of these things are going to, I believe anyways, help to inform how you occupy different roles of power, if that would be
Yeah.
fair.
And I've got to say I love that, because that is the heart of all of this is people are not always aware of the power and influence they have. So first of all, recognizing power never doesn't exist. There's power in all your relationships, power dynamics, and not always big ones. But first of all, being aware of that, and you and I have talked before too. And what I love about what you're saying is there's so many spectrums of behavior. And instead of saying, you as an assertive person are bad for being assertive because you're an assertive male and that's going to oppress people. No, no, no. It's like you said, can you go into a room and say, gee, I'm aware that I'm assertive and I actually don't think this fits the situation. So I'm going to try moving on this spectrum to more compassionate.
Mm-hmm.
Or I recognized I'm a really organized person and can I be a bit more spontaneous in this moment, or vice versa. So I really love what you're saying there.
Absolutely. And thank you. A lot of the work that I've been doing prior to this podcast is about communication and the power of voice. And there was something that you mentioned maybe 6 or 7 minutes ago about how female voices and male voices are interpreted and perceived differently. I wonder if you could speak a bit more to that, because I find myself quite curious on that point.
Yeah, and I should have studied before this. I don't remember the exact studies and numbers, so I do want to disclaim this.
Mm-hmm.
But in a general sense, and this is really where it comes more. I know you talked a little bit about the biological, but there's so much societal and social training, as it were, nature versus nurture, really on the nurture side of how we perceive masculine and feminine. If you look back, there are matriarchal societies, and they perceive this differently, but there's been very few to study. And when we look at, for example, and I'm like I said, I'm going to guess the numbers here, but I believe it was when they were in a setting and they had men and women speak for equal amounts of time, and they timed this. Everyone, I believe, including the women, thought that the women spoke more. And so we think about, even in movies are another great example, right? All our media, there tends to be more male dialogue. And again, this isn't to um, target one specific person or say they're being bad or tell men to talk less, but recognizing that if we believe that women are speaking more when they're not, it probably means that we're limiting women having the same amount of airtime. And so our actions, if we're trying to be responsive and work to these situations, isn't saying, men aren't allowed to speak, but it might be moderating a little bit more and saying, like, well, am I aware of my perception of this and how it might not be real? And maybe I need to do something different to make sure those voices are valued as much or given as much time. They've also done some interesting studies on, numbers of people in different workplaces. So, like, if there's one woman to a workforce of all men, um, how that works and how that interplays, and how many people it takes to actually start privileging those voices as well. Because it's also hard for a group of men to then have a completely different experience, have this one voice come in? Do they need to be actually more voices? They've suggested that, I want to say it was like 3 or 4 women in a team to start actually getting some sort of balance and equality in that voice. So there's a ton of studies. I'd encourage people to go out and not just listen to my not for sure numbers. But I think, as we've talked about through this whole piece, so much of it is, am I aware of my biases, my perceptions here? As a woman as well, I have to be aware of, am I judging myself? Am I judging other women? Because it's so ingrained in all of us how this operates.
A couple things pique my curiosity from that share, Leo. The first piece is something you said about if we are perceiving that women are speaking the same amount or more, rather, when they are speaking the same amount, that it could indicate that we are moving away from an equitable share of time and space. And I wonder, and I don't know if you have the answer for this, and this is just one of these curiosities, if the cadence of speech and the words per minute contribute to that interpretation. Because again, here we are quoting vague studies from the past that we can't necessarily remember, but I do recall words per minute is typically higher for women. They will actually use more words in 1 minute than than a man will on average. And so I can imagine that the perception might be distorted in the sense that if you have a man and a woman speaking for 5 minutes equally, but she's able to be articulate and expressive at 25% greater words per minute, then there's more information being transferred per time. And so it's like, that's a natural difference in terms of communication styles that might be contributing to that. And so I think, just as like we were speaking to before, greater awareness of these differences can help us even the playing field in these types of workspaces.
Yeah. See, and I appreciate you brought that up, because there is a piece, obviously, of people do communicate differently. They have different cadences, obviously different pitch of voice. All these different pieces can come into play. I also want to, I guess, not caution, but I think another thing to be aware of is how much people are invested in the status quo. And so the study that has not happened yet with power in the brain, which I would like to see happen in the future, if any scientists who work on the power and brain are listening to this, would actually be to see how the brain reacts to moving from a position of power to one of equality. Because we know anecdotally, and like great quotes around, when you've lived with privilege, equality feels like oppression, one of my favorites. And when we look at that, and how much, we have some of these counter movements that happen in our society of white lives matter and men's rights marches and straight pride parades, they can seem maybe very valuable to people and some maybe ridiculous to some, but the reality is they're people who have had power historically feeling this loss and potentially going into, I'm curious, the part I would love to know is if they go into that amygdala fear space, even though they're not fully in a position with less power, but now that they have less power than they did have, if they start feeling that fear and want to fight back. And the reason I brought this up with this particular study is I do believe sometimes in people wanting to almost defend the status quo, there also do come up these kind of studies of saying like, well, this happens, but like women speak more, so we should take that into account too. And there can be some pretty subtle, I don't think this is you, because we've had great conversations about this, but I think there can be some really subtle interplays about how we then almost defend some of these pieces, and really being aware of that as potentially a bias as well. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I want to parse apart a bit of a nuance that arose in there, because as much as we were speaking about generalizations as insufficient for generating rules, I think that, I'm reminded of a quote from the comedian Theo Vaughn, right? He was doing a bit and he's just like, I hear, I don't want to make his accent, but he's got a very nice Southern accent. He says, I hear people talking about white privilege, and, I, I don't know where you got it, but it must have missed me, because he grew up quite poor in the South, and he was in a predominantly black neighborhood, and he was living in the same sort of conditions with other white people and black people, and it didn't touch him. That was his whole story. And he had a great funny bit about it. I'm not going to deliver the humor with adequate zeal here, but that idea that you talk about caution and the inadequacy of generalizations to be able to generate meaningful rules of action. I think that that's a place where I find myself hesitant to start say, well, okay, all of this group has had power. All of this group has been oppressed. All of, because when we're talking about the individual relationships, that's the locus of where the most truth derives itself. And so when we speak about generalizations, we have to speak about in general, more often than not, on average, historically speaking, for most people, and being able to leave room for that difference. And so, to speak to your question around the amygdala activation and why people get so up in arms and have these reactive responses, be they men, women, European descendant or otherwise, I believe it comes down to like really a sense of being known, being seen, and feeling valued. I think that's really the key, is that when I have encountered people who carry this kind of reactive flag, who are so anti one thing and pro another, there is really this clear sense that they feel maybe erased, forgotten, neglected, written out of the story, or painted over by this brush of you are the oppressor, or you're this, or you ought to be guilty for that. And the room for their uniqueness, the room for their voice, be it a man, a woman, anybody from any different race, that is a common experience. It's more present in particular groups, but whenever someone encounters that experience of being erased or painted with an entire brush, we bristle, to not to, no pun intended, but there is this natural state of like, hey, I'm here and I matter. And I think that that's an important piece to recognize, that all statements, regardless of what they are, can cut out the space for people's value to be acknowledged.
Yes, and this is a really fine balance, because this is obviously a much more complex discussion and situation, and generalizations are not great. And I do want to acknowledge, first of all, too, when I'm talking about these statuses and how society gives some of this unearned influence to people, I am talking from our context. Like, there's plenty of places in the world that I could go as a white person, and I would not be the majority, and obviously there'd be different dynamics there. And to the person that you spoke with who grew up in poverty, poverty is another status, right? Versus people who have wealth or housing or whatever that would have more status. And the one piece, though, I do want to be really careful about how we address or how we talk about, because I've heard this a lot, and I've heard this from people in positions of great power, people in positions, is that it is uncomfortable to acknowledge that you've had a privilege. And it's not to say that personal values and like people needing to be heard, like those are all very core needs that every human has. And I want to almost remove that from this conversation, because what happens is people can take that on as the role. And it's not to say it's not a very important thing, and that everyone, like, that's a human right that you should be heard and acknowledged. But to say, if we are going to create healthy shifts, being aware of these dynamics should be a base. And so and this layers with some other pieces, right? You have some personal sense of power, first of all, that can be different. I know as a woman, something that has helped me a lot is I've always had a pretty strong personal sense of power. So I've been maybe less afraid to raise my voice in those times when maybe people were judging and being like, she's talking too much. So that does play into it. There can be a sense of personal power. There's, of course, this intersectionality of all these different role statuses, ways of being in the world at the same time. So, yes, you could be white and be a woman. You could be well educated. You could have more or less money. You could be housed, unhoused. You could be differently abled. There's so many of these pieces that layer together. So, first, acknowledging that can be a part of people's experience, that yes, they have more power in some ways and less power in other ways. And I think it's very common that when people feel a personal pain or worry or concern, like people who are maybe reactive to some of these movements, if they use power to talk about it. So like when we say like, oh, I don't have any power in this situation, it can be a very slippery and dangerous slope. Because of course you can have this sense that you don't have as much influence. And I've heard parents say this a lot, right? Oh, my teenager's gone wild. I don't have any power. Well, you still own the house. You're feeding them. They don't have any money. They don't have any access to these resources. So you might not feel that sense right now. And that might be scary to you, right? That amygdala. I'm curious if that activates the same way. But ultimately you do. And it can be very dangerous. And so like, same thing. If white people in general, let's say in Calgary, where I am situated, if white people say, hey, we actually don't have, I don't feel like we have power anymore because, there's all these different groups that have come in and I feel like they have more power. Well, if you were out there and something happened and you talked to a cop, we actually know that actually what would happen is they'd be more likely to value that voice more. It's not by a huge amount. It's not because they're trying to be mean, but it's how society's trained us. So I just really want to be careful when we split that idea of acknowledging power and that how that can have an influence with acknowledging that people have needs and we should be treating people with care, hearing them, respecting them, and all that.
Absolutely. And on the coattails of that piece of wisdom, we will take a short break and come back for our second half of the show. As that last bit of wisdom sinks in, I just wanted to thank you for listening to the Smiling Human podcast. If you find conversations like these to be meaningful and valuable, I would invite you to engage with this media in whatever way is available to you, be that a like, a share, a subscribe on YouTube, or following on your local podcast app and leaving a review. If you wish to support the Smiling Human podcast directly, you can consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/thesmilinghuman. Thank you for your time. Let's get back to the conversation. Wonderful. Well, Leah, it is the second half here, and that means we're going to move into the section called Question of the Week. This is where I invite the guests to bring with them an inquiry that's meaningful to them, to the topic, and to their experience, one that I do not know, and it's probably one of my most favorite parts of the show. So, Leah, what have you got for us this week?
Well, so something I had the privilege of having a bike ride with a good friend and a business contact this week. And in it, one of the things we were talking about in terms of business and how we, reach out there and market and all of these pieces was around how much basically do you have to use existing systems. Obviously I talk about this stuff a lot because it's going to relate to the begin or to our earlier conversation, but how much do you have to work in individual systems to bring people to a place of a healthier system, or can you approach them from a healthier system and be successful in business? And I'm happy to expand on that if it doesn't make sense and give you more context.
Totally. I'll pass one thing to you. It reminds me
Please.
a quote from Buckminster Fuller. He says, "We do not innovate by fixing the old, but by building the new." So please, I'd love to hear more what you have to say about those that approach in that conversation.
Yeah. So the conversation started specifically, what we were talking about was marketing in general, and people tend to make decisions just in a general sense. People make decisions either because they're moving towards something they want and is pleasurable, or because they're moving away from some sort of pain that they want to get rid of. And from a marketing perspective, most people would tell you you have to talk about that pain, right? How many people know they should exercise and know they should eat healthier and don't for a long, long time? And then on the flip side, they suddenly get told, oh, you're pre-diabetic. And oh, suddenly now like exercise is important. I'm moving away from this pain. So I'm going to take action. And so we're talking about that in terms of business, right? If are people buying, if you're just advertising all the lovely things that you can offer, or do you need to actually say, hey, there's a negative thing in your life? So that was where our conversation started. And then to layer into it, just another beautiful piece was I also got to attend a brief session. We were talking about Indigenous. We had an Indigenous elder who was talking about some pieces of business, but also life. And I was thinking about, there's this beautiful example of a society who I would say before a lot of other things happened, had a much healthier way of approaching this and probably would have been much more likely to make those decisions from a place of joy and gratitude and plentifulness Whereas in our current society, we focus a lot more on those places of fear and scarcity. So that was the context of the conversation. I'd love to hear your thoughts about it.
Absolutely. The last time we spoke, I mentioned a book to you that I was reading and have since finished, uh, titled The More Beautiful World Our Hearts Know Is Possible by Charles Eisenstein. And the heart of this book, I think, speaks greatly to what you're talking to. But before I dive into that, I guess I want to just illuminate. It sounds as though there's the implication that by focusing on pain points, that action is implicitly unhealthy. Is that a part of the assumption for this exploration?
Well, and see, that's another great point, which we didn't decide on. This was again kind of more of a discussion. I think something that I always try to consider, and this is where it becomes I'm not sure if it's healthy or unhealthy, is how much in doing my work in a way that it's accessible to people am I able to help them move paradigm shifts. And a shift that I don't think is healthy in our society is how focused we can be on scarcity. And the scarcity is the piece that I think would be nice to be able to move away from, because you just look at our whole society and how we value money and resources and how we tend to hoard them and feel this great sense of loss constantly. That piece I don't think is healthy in our society, but recognizing that it's very healthy also for people to move away from pain, and that sense is also important. So yes and no.
Totally. Absolutely. I think this ties so beautifully into Charles' work as well, because when we're speaking about the story in terms of marketing and, okay, well, we can talk about pain. And if we talk about pain for what it deeply and authentically is, I think that we can facilitate these shifts into new paradigms more easily than when we focus on the outdated and almost um, archaic story of scarcity and separation. So I'll put a bit more detail to what I mean by deep and authentic. So essentially, when we look at the big fears, right, it's the fear of death, the fear of abandonment, the fear of being unloved. There's these like really core pieces, right? No belonging, no resources, I die. And when we're operating from the predisposition, the presumption that this universe is geared towards that, it's geared towards me being without, me being separate, me not having what I need, then there is a deep set programming that shapes our interpretive mechanisms. And in a lot of cases, the marketing psychology that developed out of the 60s, it was the cousin of Freud, actually, who started to build this. I can't remember his name exactly. Plays on those base fears. And those base fears are exaggerated by a society that has overemphasized individualism and materialism rather than a relational base for our existence. And so, okay, building a story that gears us towards focus on scarcity and focus on separation, although it is also focused on pain, I would 100% agree is unhealthy and is actually perpetuating the kind of inner turmoil that we see spreading out across cultures and really deteriorating mental health, physical health, relational health, and the like. So I do also think, though, that if we include a recognition of the current pain for what it actually is, a lack of belonging, a lack of meaningful relationships, a lack of fulfilling activities and engagements, and this demonizing of pleasure, joy, and gratitude that comes from overemphasis on productivity, that if we can talk to that point and say, look, there is a more beautiful world that our hearts know is possible. Thank you, Charles. And yet we're not there. And it hurts to not be there, right? As a coach and a mentor, someone who facilitates transformational workshops, pain points are the accelerating catalyst for change. And so if we can identify accurately what the pain point genuinely is, it's not that you don't have the car or that you don't belong to this social group. It's an internal piece about how you're relating to your own being, your own culture, your own tribe, so to say. I think that that's a greater starting point where we can actually, I don't want to say set the roadmap, but at least gain or garner momentum towards shifting into these new paradigms.
See, and I very much agree with you, and I agree that greater is possible. That's certainly what I hope for, and also want to work towards. And I think there's a couple pieces, because obviously the system, like you said, for marketing, for example, is based in much more of like the 60s and how we built it. And I think there's a couple pieces that play in too that are helpful to acknowledge. That one, we have a negativity bias. That's just the way our brains work. It, bush rustles, I want to think tiger so I can run away and survive. There's still pieces of that are inherent in our mindset that we do need to acknowledge. And I think this is also really just an interesting one, though, when you look at it's hard to distinguish from society. It's hard to separate this from what is happening in our current civilization. And what's coming to mind is I read quite an interesting study on helicopter parenting. And it was talking, obviously, helicopter parenting is much more common in the US and Canada and like this Western world. And they compared it to families and parents in Scandinavian countries. I don't remember if it was a specific one. And they found that there was much less helicopter parenting. And this person supposed that might be that there was so much more social security. Because part of helicopter parenting comes from a fear of, if I don't make sure that my kid isn't hurt and gets into the right school and gets a good career, they could end up alone on the street and die. To over exaggerate at this piece. But I also do think when we look at some of the challenges that families face right now in terms of inequality of money, there is and I don't want to say reality, but there is a scarcity of resource that a lot of people feel, and it's hard to fully separate that, to fully say that people should be in a healthier place. And like thinking, I know Maslow's hierarchy of needs isn't fully accurate, but just thinking about how many people are legitimately worried about, will I have enough to feed my family? What happens in this financial situation? There's also a piece to play in there. And I'd love your thoughts on how we can create a sense of fulfillment. Because I do agree with you on the emotional side. I think we could do a better job finding belonging. But how do we create that sense when there is literally physical needs that people are worried about?
There's two trajectories that I could explore, and I'd love to explore both of them in response to that question. The first is answering your question on a greater time scale than just the current moment, current month, or current year. And I think that has a lot to do with child rearing, how it is we're treating babies, particularly. I'm reading, almost done, a book called The Continuum Concept. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. Extraordinarily paradigm shifting book. And it's been around for 45 years, I think, or so, 50 maybe. And what it speaks to is, in the West, we have neglected and almost atrophied a very important quality of the child rearing process, which is the in arms phase immediately post birth, and how the, cry it out mentality actually shifts and imprints on the nervous systems of people this very same scarcity dynamic that you're speaking to, that shows up later in life when they have their own kids and when they're dealing with the world at large. And so in one sense, holding your child as long as and for as much time as you possibly can immediately post birth goes a long way into shifting how people grow up to experience resource availability, abundance, or scarcity. So child rearing is a very short answer to
First
that.
18 months. Hold them all
Yeah.
you can, all the interaction. Yeah, I'm with you. Yeah.
It's 18 up to 3 years. Like the thing is, there's an expectancy in the child to have immediate and unconditional access to mother. And that recognition, the expectancy to have immediate and unavailable access, is no different than to have immediate and unavailable access to resources.
100%.
Is the life sustaining force there? And when at least this is the point of the book, when the infant's psychophysiology is satiated, it will move away naturally. It'll start to do its crawling and then come back and venture farther out into the world, and it will dictate its own development, rather than this sort of concept that you can spoil a child by loving it too much. It's the most insane idea I've ever heard in my entire life. And so that's the piece. If you provide to your children as much and as abundantly as you can of your own love, that's going to imprint upon them the nature of reality as a whole. So that's the first piece. The second piece is how we shift. I think just like you were speaking to how all of this comes down to, in terms of power dynamics, the personal dynamic, the personal relationship, we are all carrying trauma in some sense, and not just personal trauma, but collective trauma, cultural trauma, ancestral trauma. There's deep wounds of separation from our natural way of being, and all of us have them. And all of us also have access to the means to heal them. And that's a bold statement, isn't it? Right? Well, what if I don't have the money to go and see a shaman? Or what if I don't have the money to go see a book? If you can sit and listen to yourself, if you can sit and journal, if you can learn to feel your own feelings and confront the potential that your beliefs about yourself, about your past, about your future may not actually be the most true, while still making space for the reality of your emotional experience, that is fundamentally transformative. You talked about the amygdala and how it plays into power and how it plays into power dynamics and empathy and all these pieces. When we have unresolved trauma, Leah, and I'm sure you know this, we get hijacked. Our amygdala gets hijacked, and we no longer have access to that prefrontal cortex with all of our highly evolved reasoning and problem-solving skills. It's gone. We become a reactive mess. And yet you can heal this. So I think that deeply investing in the reality of your internal experience and cultivating well-being through that particular vehicle is key.
100% on all the points you made, I think. And like you said, this is of course a longer term piece, and we were talking about the short term of how you do it in a short way now, or in a way that starts to build that. And especially with what you were speaking about at the end there, I think a skill, if I can add on, that is so beneficial for people, and I wish was maybe valued a bit more in society, is also the ability to sit with discomfort in all ways. And I do think, like, I think social media and phones are one of the things that weakens this, but even, you want to scroll on your phone because you're feeling a little uncomfortable. Are you willing to put that aside and be with the feeling and sink into it a little bit more? And even in my work, one of the pieces that I have to ask leaders is, are you willing to sit with the discomfort that maybe you didn't have the impact you wanted on your team? With your team, are you willing to sit with the discomfort that maybe this didn't happen how you wanted? Are you willing to sit with the discomfort of giving someone hard feedback? Because I recognize it's not as easy as just telling someone, oh, just do this and you'll feel good and it'll be happy, and use your AI app on your phone to, connect with your coworkers and that'll make you feel better. To truly get into what is meaningful, to get to that connection, to get to this point, you have to be willing to take that first little step and recognize your own discomfort, but be with it.
Beautiful words and a powerful sentiment, Leah. And for the leaders out there who are awakened and aroused by these ideas, who recognize that they could be doing more in themselves and for their team to bring about a greater environment and greater well-being and flourishing therein, where can they find you?
So the easiest place to find me is allthrive.ca. They can learn a little bit more about me. They can learn about my work and get some resources as well. Because if you want to start thinking about these things, planting that seed is so important. So I would love to chat if they want to reach out.
Excellent, Leah. Thank you again for your time and for this excellent discussion.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Smiling Human podcast. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing on YouTube or giving a follow on your local podcast app. I know I said it in the mid-roll, but I'll say it again. If you'd like to support this show directly, you can do so at patreon.com/thesmilinghuman. You'll gain access to perks like early access to episodes, behind-the-scenes content, as well as access to live Q&As. Also, I've just produced an insight journal and I want to give it to you for free. You can find access to this month-long personal development journal in the link below. This is in the show notes or in the YouTube description. Also, if you feel inspired by the sharing that has taken place in conversations like this, and you want to work with me directly, you can find a link to a free call below. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you again.